She watched her cub fade away. Then a stranger did the unthinkable. The African sun sets like fire across the Kalahari, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Thorny acacia trees stand guard over the endless expanse of sand and scrub. Here, life hangs by a thread, and death stalks every shadow. A lioness named Kesi emerges from behind a cluster of rocks, her golden coat dulled by dust and desperation. Her ribs show through her fur. Her eyes, once fierce as lightning, now burn with something different, something desperate. In her mouth, she carries a tiny bundle of fur, her cub, the smallest of her litter, born weak, born fighting for every breath. She sets him down gently in the shade of a dead tree. His chest rises and falls in shallow gasps. His eyes are closed. His tiny paws twitch as though reaching for something that isn't there. Kesi lies beside him, her massive head lowering to nuzzle his fragile body. She knows. Every mother knows when the end is near. But she doesn't know that someone is watching. 300 yards away, crouched behind a termite mound, wildlife conservationist Marcus Chen adjusts his binoculars. He's been tracking this pride for weeks, documenting their struggle through the worst drought in decades. Through his lens, he sees the lioness, sees the cub, sees the story written in her posture. His heart sinks. He's witnessed this scene too many times before. Marcus is no stranger to loss. 5 years ago, he held his own dying daughter in a hospital room, watching as machines beeped and tubes carried life into her small body. He couldn't save her then. But maybe, just maybe, he can save this one. He reaches for his veterinary kit, the one he carries everywhere, the one that holds hope in small vials and syringes. His hands shake as he checks the contents. Antibiotics, glucose, a chance. Looking back, Marcus remembers another cub, 3 years earlier, deep in the Serengeti. A male cub, barely 2 weeks old, abandoned by his mother during a territorial fight. Marcus found him near death, covered in flies, his tiny body burning with fever. Against all odds, Marcus raised him, fed him every 2 hours from a bottle, kept him warm through cold nights, taught him to hunt with toy mice and scraps of meat. For 6 months, that cub was his world. When the time came to release him back into the wild, Marcus cried like he hadn't cried since his daughter's funeral. The cub padded away into the grass, strong and wild and free. Marcus never saw him again, but sometimes, in quiet moments, he wonders if that lion remembers the human who held him when the world felt too big and too cold. Now, watching Kesi through his binoculars, Marcus feels that familiar ache. The pull between intervention and nature. The weight of playing God in a world that doesn't ask for human mercy. But the cub's breathing is getting weaker. Kesi lifts her head and releases a sound that cuts through the evening air. Not quite a roar, not quite a whimper. It's the sound of a mother calling for help in the only language she knows. Marcus makes his choice. He rises slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Each step across the sandy earth feels like walking through time itself. Kesi sees him coming, her ears flatten, her muscles coil. Every instinct screams at her to defend, to attack, to drive away this threat. But something stops her. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's the way Marcus moves, careful, respectful, like he's approaching a cathedral instead of a predator. He stops 20 feet away and sits in the sand. For 10 minutes, neither moves. The cub's breathing grows more labored. Kesi's tail flicks once, twice, then stills. She looks at her cub, then at Marcus, then back at her cub. In her amber eyes, Marcus sees a question forming, a desperate calculation. This human, this strange, small creature, carries no scent of aggression, no hunter's swagger, only something that feels almost like understanding. And then, the impossible happens. Kesi stands. She picks up her cub so gently that her massive jaws seem made for nothing but tenderness. She walks toward Marcus, each step a leap of faith that defies millions of years of evolution. She stops just an arm's length away. For a heartbeat, predator and human breathe the same air, share the same gravity, exist in the same impossible moment. She sets the cub down between them. Then, with a movement so subtle it's almost imagined, she nudges the tiny body toward Marcus. Her golden eyes lock onto his. In them, he sees everything: fear, hope, desperation, and something that transcends species. The universal cry of a parent who has run out of options. Marcus extends his hands slowly. The cub weighs nothing, a handful of fur and fading heartbeats. His body is hot with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow. Marcus feels for a pulse, finds it weak but steady. He reaches into his kit, draws up a small dose of antibiotic, finds a vein tinier than a blade of grass. The injection is swift, gentle, then glucose to feed the starving cells, fluids to replace what the fever has stolen. Kesi watches every movement. When Marcus wraps the cub in a soft cloth from his pack, she leans forward, sniffing, assessing. When he offers the bundle back to her, she hesitates. Then, with infinite care, she takes her baby back in her jaws and returns to her spot beneath the dead tree. Marcus doesn't leave. He can't. He sits in the sand as night falls, as stars emerge like scattered diamonds across the African sky. Every hour, he checks on the cub from a distance. The breathing stabilizes, the fever breaks, color returns to the tiny gums and tongue. By dawn, the cub is trying to nurse. 3 days pass. Marcus maintains his vigil, sleeping in his jeep, emerging only to leave fresh water nearby and monitor the patient he'll never be allowed to touch again. On the 4th morning, the cub staggers to his feet. Wobbly, uncertain, but alive. Gloriously alive. Looking back to those early days with the Serengeti cub, Marcus remembers the weight of responsibility. How he'd wake up every few hours, heart pounding, checking to make sure the tiny chest was still rising and falling. How he'd carry the cub in a sling against his chest while doing research, feeling the rapid heartbeat sync with his own. How he'd talk to him constantly, nonsense words that somehow felt important. You're going to make it, little king. You're going to be strong. The cub in the Kalahari grows stronger each day. By the end of the week, he's playing with shadows, pouncing on his mother's tail, living the life that almost slipped away. Kesi, too, has changed. The desperation has left her eyes, replaced by something Marcus has rarely seen in wild lions: gratitude. She doesn't approach him again, but she doesn't hide from him either. When he moves his jeep, she watches. When he speaks softly to his radio, her ears twitch toward the sound. On the 10th day, Marcus makes another choice. It's time to leave. He packs his equipment slowly, reluctant to break this spell, this impossible connection. As he starts his engine, Kesi lifts her head. For a moment, across the 20 feet that separates two different worlds, they look at each other. She doesn't blink. Neither does he. Then she does something that stops his heart. She stands, takes 3 steps toward him, and sits. Just sits, looking at him with those amber eyes. It lasts only seconds, but it feels like forever. An acknowledgement, a thank you, a goodbye. Then she returns to her cub, who tumbles toward her with the boundless energy of the living. Marcus drives away, but he stops the jeep after a mile. In his rearview mirror, he can see Kesi in the distance, a golden speck beneath the dead tree that has become a symbol of life renewed. He thinks about the Serengeti cub, now grown and wild somewhere in the grasslands. He thinks about his daughter, who would have loved this story. He thinks about the moment when a mother's love transcended every boundary evolution had built. 6 months later, Marcus returns to the same spot. The dead tree is still there, but Kesi and her pride have moved on, following the rains to greener territory. He finds their tracks in the mud near a waterhole 5 miles away. Large paw prints and smaller ones. A family, intact, moving through their ancient world. That evening, as Marcus sits by his campfire, he hears them. A roar in the distance, deep and powerful and unmistakably alive. He can't be sure, but he likes to think it's the cub he helped save, now growing into his voice, claiming his place in the pride. The sound carries across the African night like a promise, like proof that sometimes, when we reach across the divide between species, between worlds, something beautiful happens. Looking back to all the cubs he's known, Marcus understands something fundamental about his work. It's not about playing God or interfering with nature. It's about recognizing that compassion itself is natural, that mercy exists in the wild, not as human projection, but as something real and raw and essential. That a mother's love, whether human or lion, speaks the same desperate language when everything else has failed. In his journal that night, Marcus writes, "Today, I remembered why I do this work. Not to change nature, but to honor it. To recognize that in the space between species, between understanding and instinct, something sacred lives. The mother asked for help. I gave it. She trusted me with her most precious gift. In return, she gave me something I'd forgotten how to believe in. Proof that love is stronger than fear, that hope exists even in the wildest places, and that sometimes the impossible is just another word for necessary. The stars wheel overhead, ancient and constant. Somewhere in the darkness, a mother lion sleeps beside her healthy cub. Somewhere else, the memory of a human who cared enough to try becomes part of her story. Part of the invisible thread that connects all living things in the endless tapestry of survival and grace. This is the story of Kesi, the lioness who trusted a stranger with her dying cub. Of Marcus, the conservationist who answered a mother's desperate call. Of a moment when two different species found common ground in the most fundamental thing of all, the fierce love of a parent for their child. The African wilderness is harsh, unforgiving, ruled by instinct and survival. But sometimes, just sometimes, it makes room for something more, something that reminds us that compassion isn't weakness, but the strongest force in nature. If this story moved you, share it, remember it, and never forget that in a world that often feels divided, love still builds bridges across the impossible spaces between us. Until next time, keep believing in the extraordinary moments that make us human.